good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's SCRIBO seminar. For those who might not know me, my name is Barbara Montecchi, and I'm a team member of the InScribe research project. I'm replacing Silvia Ferrari today, who unfortunately can't join us today, and I will introduce this webinar and present our guest speaker, Lee Overmann. I'm sure many of you already know her and her works, of course. She's an archaeologist and anthropologist specialized in cognitive archaeology. She earned her doctorate from the University of Oxford. Subsequently, she was awarded with a number of postdoctoral fellowships, both in Europe and in the US. And currently, she is the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Archaeology of the University of Colorado. Among her research interests, I can mention the origin of numerical notations and their interactions with the writing systems, especially in Mesopotamia. So the interaction between the origin of numbers in prehistory and the relation with the origin of writing of proto-cuneiform and subsequently cuneiform. Today she will be talking about abstract and concrete counting. I see in among the audience a speaker we welcomed last year, Stephen Chrysomalis, who also talked about written numerical notation. So I'm really happy to welcome Lee Overmann today and hear about updates and a different perspective. I'm sure it will be very stimulating for the debate too, at the end of the talk, of course. So over to you, Lee, with updating the abstract concrete distinction.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My only regret is that I don't get a chance to actually visit Italy, that I am actually speaking to you from Michigan, which is a nice place, but it's no Italy. In philosophy, the terms abstract and concrete denote whether or not an object described in language has a physical referent. Words like house and fork have physical reference in a way that words like justice and truth do not. For decades, the terms abstract and concrete have dominated Mesopotamian numbers. However, I will argue today that they inaccurately characterize what numbers are as concepts, that they grossly underestimate the complexity of numbers before they become mediated by symbolic notations, and finally, that they oversimplify how numbers change once they become written. To re-examine the terms abstract and concrete as historically applied to Mesopotamian numbers, let's begin with what a number is, and more importantly, what it is not. The philosopher Bertrand Russell said that, quote, "A particular number is not identical with any collection of terms having that number. The number 3 is not identical with the trio consisting of Brown, Jones, and Robinson. The number 3 is something which all trios have in common and which distinguishes them from other collections. A number is something that characterizes certain collections, namely those that have that number." In Russell's view, a number is a property, quantity, or cardinality that sets of objects share. This is a key insight that a single trio has a property, threeness, which is not itself a number, but 2 or more trios share this property, and that is a number, the number 3. Russell's insight can also be understood through his theory of logical types. Type 1 entities or objects are physical referents. Type 2 entities are sets of objects like a trio, which has a property of quantity. Type 3 entities are properties of quantity shared between sets of objects, and this is a number. And type 4 entities are sets of numbers like the counting sequence 1, 2, 3. Using Russell's definition, numbers are shared properties and as such are abstract. So immediately, just as soon as there is such a thing as a number, it's already abstract. Numbers are also concrete in depending on material forms, both physical objects with quantity and the devices we use to represent it. And this is true no matter how elaborated they become. Simply, abstractness is not something that develops at some point, nor is concreteness something that is ultimately discarded. The term abstract is also associated with the idea that numbers and other mathematical objects exist independently of both the sensible world and the mind. This view dates back 2,500 years to Plato, who never satisfactorily explained how we might contact objects that are eternal, external, invisible, and intangible, which lack position, point, and place in space and time, and which have no causal influence on events or situations. Nonetheless, numbers have qualities that imply they do exist in some way. For example, given a sequence of counting numbers and the concept of divisibility, we all find the same prime numbers, not none or different ones. Such discoverability implies that there is something there to be discovered. Numbers also have a unique air of universality and truth about them. As the linguist Noam Chomsky once put it, quote, "We might say that in the study of arithmetic, there are just the arithmetical truths. There are the properties of the numbers. So the fact that the square root of 2 is irrational is just like the sun has helium in it. And if we take a classical view of mathematics, then the truths of mathematics are just truths on a par with the truths of physics even. They are truths that are independent of our ways of thinking." A related set of ideas and terms comes from the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. Tokens are physical objects, like the various instances of the letter A shown on the slide, and they are analogous to Plato's category of sensible particulars. In comparison, a type is a concept that encompasses all such relevant tokens, analogous to Plato's category of universals. This type-token distinction is important because the term token has been used to label the clay objects used for counting in Neolithic Mesopotamia. And it's been claimed that tokens were used without any concept of number, that is, without types. But this would be a significant cognitive deficiency, and a very odd one indeed, given the heightened inventiveness that characterized the Neolithic. Speaking of cognitive matters, the term abstract also has a psychological meaning, since the cognitive process that forms categories from particulars is called abstraction, and the concepts it forms are called abstract. Abstraction can be further parsed as generalization, decontextualization, synthesis, and reification. Immediately when we have a concept of number, we have abstraction in the psychological sense, because forming the concept means identifying a property that is common to sets of objects and which can be then applied to new sets. So in the psychological sense of the term, numbers are abstract from their inception. But here again, numbers are also concrete. As ineffable concepts of quantity shared between sets of objects, numbers are easily visualized and expressed in material form, as for example, by pointing to something that has the quantity in question, or by displaying the requisite number of fingers. Visualizing numbers is not merely enabled by the use of material forms, it arguably depends on them, because language has little capacity to instantiate quantity. That is, the number of syllables in a number word is not what makes it numerically meaningful. And the material forms we use for numbers, including notations, not only make these ideas visible, tangible, and manipulable, they also act as mechanisms for elaboration and transmission. As a result, numbers remain materially bound or concrete, no matter how elaborated they become. Since numbers on several accounts now are both always abstract and remain concrete, these labels are inaccurate and outdated. Further, these labels have kept us from trying to look more closely at the phenomena in question. What we need is a new way to describe the conceptualization process and how and why a conceptual product might change. To understand these matters, we need to look briefly at how numbers begin and become elaborated. There's more to a number than its cardinality, since numbers also have content, structure, and organization. As concepts of shared cardinality, numbers are discrete rather than approximate, and they are arranged in order of increasing magnitude rather than in descending or random order. Numbers also have relations between them, including ones that bundle or group. And these relations let us manipulate numbers with operations like addition. For highly elaborated numbers, like those of the West, all these attributes and more are present, and numbers have become a system of relational entities or objects defined by their relations. But numbers do not arrive preloaded with all these attributes. Emerging numbers are approximate, they are not ordered, and they might not count any higher than about 3 or 4. Understanding how a system of relational numbers is realized and elaborated means looking at the perceptual experience of quantity and the material devices used to make it visible, tangible, and manipulable. Numbers begin with an evolutionarily provided ability to perceive quantity that we share with other species. This biological endowment lets us recognize or subitize small quantities up to about 3 or 4. Above that range, we see many. And within the range of many, we see bigger or smaller in groups or differences of magnitude as long as that difference is above a threshold of noticeability. Using Russell's definition of numbers as quantity shared between sets, perceptual discriminations involve properties of quantity, not numbers. What we need is a second set to share quantity and then make it visible. We call this second set the reference set. In emerging number systems, various objects represent concepts of the subitizable quantities. These are distributed exemplars because they exemplify small quantities but are not collected onto a single device. Across cultures and languages, the first non-subitizable quantity to emerge is 5, as a display of the fingers, or the phrase as many as the fingers on my hand, or both. This marks 2 developments: the realization of a discrete quantity beyond the subitizing range and the use of the hand as a device for representing it. We use the hand because it's literally handy and it's always within our sight. Neurologically, the parts of the brain that know the fingers and perceive quantity interact, interconnecting these functions as well as our internal and external domains of experience. Finally, everybody has the same hand, so people know what we mean when we say as many as the fingers on my hand. Using the hand as an initial reference set leaves traces in language, words for 5 that also mean hand, forms for 6 that mean 5 and 1, and numbers like 10 involved in productive structure. The prototypical sequence of devices starts with distributed exemplars and the hands. Because of the topographical layout of the brain for both the fingers and the number sense, and because of the physical structure of the hand and our visual experience of it, using the hands as a reference set gives numbers properties like discreteness, linearity, and stable order, as well as organization by 5s and 10s. But as a device for representing quantity, the hand is perishable because sooner or later it's needed for something else. Its capacity is also limited, typically to 5 per hand. Given social needs for numbers, people will look for something that does what the hand does in representing numbers, but for longer and with greater capacity. Fingers are typically followed by devices that accumulate, like the tally. These work like the hand did in accumulating, but they add capacity and persistence. Higher numbers mean that there is more potential for relations, but these are difficult to realize because there isn't any bundling yet beyond what the hands might influence. Because of the way our quantity perception works, the quantity of more than 3 or 4 notches can't be appreciated just by looking, putting them under pressure to be grouped. But notches can't easily be grouped since it's difficult to move or remove them once they've been made. So, given social needs for numbers, people will look for something that does what the tally does, but which also groups and which can be easily manipulated. The Neolithic tokens both grouped and were manipulable, and as such, they helped realize new relations and operations. Now, tokens aren't the only way grouping and manipulability can emerge, merely one used in Mesopotamia. Tokens only become visible to us in the 4th millennium when they were impressed into clay, which was also the beginning of writing. It's worth taking a moment to look at a fundamental difference between signs for numbers and signs for language, because they represent meaning differently. Numerical signs instantiate quantity. That is, 4 wedges are 4, 6 cones are 6. Their quantity is unambiguous, so these signs don't need to be specified further, even if conventionalized. In contrast, ideographs signify through convention, pictographs through resemblance. These modes are ambiguous in what they mean, necessitating strategies like determinatives and phonography at the cost of greater visual complexity in the sign's form. Instantiation makes written numbers contiguous with numbers that are not written. That is, 3 fingers, 3 beads on an abacus, and 3 strokes in the Roman numeral 3 are 3. Instantiation is semantically sufficient without phonetic clues. This has no counterpart in language because there is no inherent sheepness to the signs. There's also no instantiation or semantic sufficiency to degrade by increasing their visual complexity, by adding things that specify designate the word more specifically. I will discuss the elaborational effects of notations shortly, but from the discussion to this point, you should hopefully be able to see that numbers acquire attributes as new material forms are recruited, and that adding new material forms is the mechanism of numerical elaboration. There's also an inherent commonality to the processes of realization and elaboration. This is because all societies start with the same sense of quantity, the same 5-fingered limbs, the same behavioral suite, and the same material world that can be rearranged. In addition, the recruitment of new material forms is also systematized by what's already in place and what it doesn't do, and our habituation to this. These factors account for some of the universality noticed by Plato and other thinkers. Now, there is evidence of this prototypical process for Mesopotamia. Ancient peoples had the same sense of quantity and 5-fingered hands, since all primates have these. It goes back much further than the ancient world. Support for their having had the same sense of quantity takes the form of grammatical number. Now, this is the feature that distinguishes singular and plural. Across languages, grammatical number conforms to the perceptual experience of quantity, with singles, duals, sometimes trials, very rarely quadrils, and many. Grammatical number in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Elamite shows this characteristic 1, 2, 3, many signature. Further, differences of structure, marking, and animacy imply that grammatical number developed independently in these 3 languages. That is, before the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Elamites had much contact with each other in the Neolithic. Grammatical number also emerges after lexical numbers do, which means that lexical numbers would have emerged in the Paleolithic. Now, numerical structure supports the idea that ancient peoples counted with their hands. Akkadian and Elamite numbers were decimal, and decimal organization is very classically considered to arise from counting with the 2 hands. The sexagesimal Sumerian numbers had a subbase of 10. Now, Sumerian lexical numbers show the use of the hand in counting, as the lexical forms for 6, 7, and 9 are 5 plus the appropriate smaller numbers. Admittedly, this lexical insight comes much later in the 3rd millennium. This is because the system of writing first had to develop the ability to record sound values, and then the motivation to do this with signs for numbers, which work better without such phonetic clues because adding them increases their visual complexity and destroys their ability to mean through instantiation. Despite the evidence being later, remember that the hand is the first material structure used to realize and represent the first non-subitizable quantities, and that traces of this persist in language. So while the evidence is from the 3rd millennium, the use of the hand would be much older. Now, tallies are also found in Mesopotamia. The earliest come from the Levant and date to the Paleolithic, but these artifacts are ambiguous regarding any use for counting. Unambiguous tallies are attested in the 2nd and 1st millennia. They are either described textually or found archaeologically. It's worth mentioning 2 things here. First, the environmental conditions in the Mesopotamian region are particularly poor for preserving organic materials, which is what tallies tend to be made of. So it's not really all that surprising that the ones found are fairly recent. Second, the Mesopotamian region only became inhabited in the Neolithic, so we can't expect to find any Paleolithic artifacts there in the first place. Finally, it's also worth mentioning that reference sets used for representing, like the fingers, are a form of abstraction, a material form. That is, fingers are not themselves the items being counted, but in representing the idea of quantity shared between sets of objects, they function to abstract the quantity of the enumerated set. Tallies and tokens are also material forms of abstraction, as they enable quantity to be used away from both the objects being counted and the people doing the counting. This removes detail and context, which is a type of abstraction. Now, cuneiform numbers are unambiguous as numbers, and their numerical meaning anchors and attests the numerical meaning of the technologies that preceded them, the proto-cuneiform notations and the numerical impressions. Together, impressions, proto-cuneiform notations, and cuneiform numbers attest the numerical meaning of tokens, at least in the mid-4th millennium, when impressions and tokens are found as assemblages whose sizes, shapes, and quantities are closely matched. Together, these technologies would have dramatic effects on the way numbers were conceptualized. But before describing the changes to the way numbers were conceptualized that occurred in conjunction with writing, I want to talk about the history of numbers in Mesopotamia, how they have been understood, where the labels abstract and concrete originally came from, the effects their use has had, and the phenomena the authors were trying to describe when they used these terms. I will also propose new ways of understanding the phenomena of interest without using the terms. The number systems of Mesopotamia, and specifically of Samaria, are known for two things. The first is using tokens for counting. Tokens have been seen primarily through the eyes of archaeologist Denise Schmandt-Besseret, who said that these artifacts, quote, reflected an archaic mode of counting, of concrete counting, prior to the invention of abstract numbers. This is supported by the fact that there are no tokens to express abstractly numbers such as 1 or 10. Instead, a particular counter was needed to account for each type of goods. Jars of oil were counted with ovoids, small measures of grain with cones, and large measures of grain with spheres. The term token evokes Peirce's type token distinction. So when Schmandt-Besseret claimed that tokens were used in one-to-one correspondence without a number system, she was essentially asserting that Neolithic peoples were incapable of conceptualizing types. However, an inability to form types or categories would be a significant cognitive deficiency. More narrowly, Neolithic peoples might have lacked the ability to form types only for numbers. However, this would be an even more unusual cognitive deficiency. Broad or narrow, the claim is disproven by evidence showing that Mesopotamian peoples realized and elaborated their numbers through the prototypical process, which involves forming categories or types. Schmandt-Besseret also claimed that tokens were used, quote, without a number system, consistent with her belief that tokens had no inherent numerical meaning or relation to one another beyond representing one-to-one whatever it was they counted. However, the impressed tokens of the early Uruk period show bundling relations, which means that counting was not one-to-one. In the one-to-one relation, each item in a set is matched to an item in a second set, with none left unmatched or matched more than once. Within each set, items have the same value, since being different in value either disqualifies them from being members of the set in the first place or limits how the items are matched across the sets. In comparison, differences of value are implicit to relations like the bundling that characterize the tokens and subsequent technologies, and they preclude the relations from being one-to-one. It simply strains credulity to think that the peoples using tokens were completely blind to these relations or that the relations simply happened by accident. Schmandt-Besseret also claimed that tokens were the first forms used for numbers. However, this cannot be the case. First, the numbers represented by tokens were already highly complex by the mid-4th millennium when they appear as numerical impressions with bundling relations and counting into the hundreds. At the same time, Proto-Semitic, the ancestor of Akkadian spoken in the early 4th millennium, had a word for 10,000. Bundling relations and counting to hundreds or thousands contrast sharply with numbers in emerging systems, which count to 2 and maybe 3 or 4 and no higher, and which lack grouping and any relations between numbers beyond some nascent recognition of their relative size. The other thing the number systems of Mesopotamia are known for is counting different types of objects differently. Schmidt-Besserat thought this indicated a rudimentary concept of number, one so absolutely concrete and fractured as to be incoherent. I'll have more to say about the use of multiple counting sequences later, but it will suffice to say here that such systems are neither uncommon nor particularly concrete. Quantity and commodity were conjoined in tokens and impressions, but writing represented them separately, something Schmidt-Besserat believed marked the emergence of an abstract concept of number. I agree that the representational separation was an abstraction, a kind that was as much material as behavioral as it would eventually become conceptual. That is, writing numbers separately was an important step in their eventual reconceptualization as a relational system. But reconceptualization was not immediate. Eleanor Robeson notes that the sexagesimal place value system functioned to intermediate between different metrological systems, which implies that numbers were still thought of as specified in the late third millennium. Nor was separating the representation of quantity and commodity the only thing that enabled numbers to eventually be reconceived as a relational system, as we will see. The numbers associated with tokens and multiple counting sequences have been considered so profoundly concrete, it's also been thought that tokens were used without any words for numbers. It is true that material representations tend to precede spoken words for numbers. This is because we perceive and understand quantity visually, whether or not we also know how to express it in language. But no known number system has the kind of discontinuity that's been claimed for Sumerian numbers, a lag in the hundreds. The problem is simply that before the third millennium, we lack phonetic insight into the words. This does not mean that there were no number words before the third millennium, as material forms like tokens and impressions are unambiguous evidence of numbers. And certainly lexical, grammatical, and ordinal forms show that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Elamites developed their numbers in the prototypical manner. Instead, the lack of insight into the spoken forms is an artifice of the writing system, which first had to develop phonography and then the motivation to apply it to numbers. Schmidt-Besserat first applied the labels abstract and concrete to writing, not numbers. She wrote, quote, "Hypotheses about the origin of writing generally postulate an evolution from the concrete to the abstract, an initial pictographic stage that, in the course of time and perhaps because of the carelessness of scribes, becomes increasingly schematic." She was describing the fact that early writing started out as little pictures that over time lost their depictiveness, so they no longer resembled the objects they meant. This change in material form signals the neurological reorganization that occurs in literacy. Signs become recognized topologically, that is, by means of their local and global features, and this relaxes the need for them to depict. As depictiveness relaxed, signs became free to covary in ways that allowed them to simplify while maximizing their contrastiveness. A more detailed description of how literacy emerges from writing is tangential to the topic at hand, but those interested can consult my 2016 paper in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. The point to remember is that Schmidt-Besserat only later applied the labels abstract and concrete to numbers, and she used them without any guiding theory, though one would soon be provided by cognitive psychologist Peter Damerow. Damerow saw token-based accounting as involving concrete numbers, with the invention of writing enabling the development of abstract or second-order numbers. We can agree with the overall progression as outlined by Damerow, since later stages developed from earlier ones. Some of the model's timeline and characterizations are undoubtedly correct, as the separation of quantity and commodity did enable their further elaboration. The Greeks, but not the Babylonians, did concern themselves with the ontological status of number, and generalized unifying mathematical concepts did emerge only recently through the work of Bertrand Russell and other philosophers. However, Damerow explicitly rooted the notions abstract and concrete in the work of psychologist Jean Piaget. This was problematic not only because Piaget's work was biased, but also because its application has left the impression that Neolithic numbers in Mesopotamia were unusually concrete. Piaget applied his ideas about cognitive development in children to entire societies, drawing in particular on work by sociologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl. Now, certainly, children think differently than adults do, and adult thinking develops from childish thinking. However, while we might justly say that later societies think differently than earlier ones, and that later thought is built upon earlier thinking, it is not true that societies develop like children into adults. Piaget's theory had the effect of categorizing some societies as adult, rational, scientific, abstract, and superior, while labeling others as childish, primitive, unscientific, concrete, and inferior. Fortunately, such characterizations have been largely abandoned as inaccurate and biased. The sense of the quote is this: we can cite as examples of the childish mentality of the inferior civilizations the tendency to affirm without proof, the emotional character of thought, its global non-analytical character, the absence of logical coherence, the difficulty of handling deductive reasoning, the frequency of reasoning by immediate identification, mystical causality, not differentiating the psychic from the physical, confusing the sign and its cause, confusing the sign and the signified, etc. We do not at all claim that each of these traits is presented in the same way in the primitive and the child, but broadly speaking, we think there are analogies. I respect that Damerow and other scholars of Mesopotamian mathematics were characterizing real phenomena using the labels they had. I want to discuss what those phenomena were and how we might characterize them without the labels abstract and concrete. I will also talk about Mesopotamian numbers in terms of what kind of numbers they were and how they might have been understood at the time. In mathematics, the labels abstract and concrete are used to differentiate numbers that are applied to particular objects from those that are not, which is one way to interpret the separate representation of quantity and commodity. However, given that numbers are both abstract from their inception and concrete no matter how elaborated they become, we cannot characterize this change as becoming abstract and no longer being concrete, but we can characterize it as a change in conceptual content and then ask how such change occurs. Besides separating the representation of quantity from that of commodity, writing had three other important effects on how numbers were conceptualized. First, written numbers were concise in a way that tokens were not, and this made them very effective at recording numerical information, especially in large volumes. Think about making a table of multiplication and how much easier it would be with writing than with tokens. But tokens were still the better technology for manipulating numbers because notations are fixed. Together, tokens for calculating and writing for recording let scribes compile large volumes of relational data, like the relations shown here with a table of reciprocals. And scribes had to rewrite and memorize these relations, which did two things. First, it helped scribes think about numbers in terms of their relations to one another, a big step in reconceptualizing numbers as a relational system. Second, it gave scribes more options in calculating. They could always go back and use tokens, but now they could also look up relations in tables or recall the relations from memory. This was a significant advance in knowledge-based calculation as opposed to movement-based calculation, as was the case with tokens. Second, handwriting helped influence numbers towards being conceptualized as entities. A collection of 4 separate elements, like 4 tokens, does not have the same physical or conceptual entitivity as a handwritten sign does, even when the handwritten sign also consists of 4 elements, like 4 wedges in the cuneiform sign for 4. This is because when we write by hand, we train our brains to recognize signs typologically by their local and global features. In other words, we teach the brain to recognize written objects as if they were physical objects, as things in themselves. This neurological reorganization gives the written sign a coherent identity that differs from that of the previous technologies, which were instead collections of discrete objects. Third, non-numerical writing allowed calculations to be recorded, initially as narrative descriptions of the steps involved, much like a cookbook recipe. This documentation helped codify the calculations as algorithms, or series of specific steps to be performed in certain orders. This allowed calculations to become longer and more complex since they no longer had to depend on human memory. This too helped numbers to be reconceptualized as objects that could be manipulated by processes and operations. Over the next several millennia, these narrative descriptions would eventually take form as signs themselves, like the familiar plus and minus signs we use today for operations like addition and subtraction. As numbers elaborate, two things happen. First, representation becomes increasingly concise. It takes the hands of 8 people to count to 75, a single tally with 75 notches, 7 tokens, numerical impressions, or proto-cuneiform signs, and only 3 cuneiform notations. This increased concision is enabled by both the material form used and an increase in implicit knowledge, or things the user must know in order to use the material form, like place value for cuneiform notations, or numerical value as encoded by shape and size for tokens. The increase in implicit knowledge allows the information explicitly represented to shrink, increasing the amount of information visually appreciable at any one time. And this enhances the potential for visualizing relations and patterns. Of course, this also comes at the cost of increasing the training needed to understand the system. Second, as new material forms are added, older ones remain in use. This means that numerical concepts become distributed over multiple material forms, becoming independent of any particular form. This too might be considered a sense in which numbers are abstract. But consider how important numerical symbols are to learning and understanding numbers today, and the fact that we still count on our fingers. The material forms we use are how we learn numbers, and they influence what we understand numbers to be. Numbers thus remain dependent on the material forms used to represent and manipulate them, the sense in which they are also concrete. Our problem in understanding the numbers used with tokens is not just a matter of the confusion created by the terms abstract and concrete. It is also this. Like token-based numbers, our numbers are highly elaborated, but our numbers are also mediated by handwritten symbols, and token-based numbers were not. So the question is, what are highly elaborated numbers like when they are not symbolically mediated? I will show 2 such number systems, one in Africa and another in Oceania, to look at the differences between knowledge-based calculation, mental calculation, and numerical expression. Notations helped change calculation from a process of moving tokens physically in space to a process of manipulating notations with arithmetic facts and mental judgments. This is an oversimplification, as the West would still be arguing the relative merits of abacus and algorithm well into the Middle Ages, so the transition was hardly complete by the Old Babylonian period. Further, tokens were interrelated through bundling, so notations were not the beginning of relations, which were in fact what permitted values to be exchanged between tokens. So the transition to knowledge-based calculation was already well underway long before writing emerged. Finally, most people calculate with a material form of some sort rather than mentally. Mental calculation also presupposes that relations are available and applied. However, mental calculation encounters the limits of human memory and attention. So calculating materially, whether with an abacus or notations, is generally easier, more accurate, and more reliable. It also has the added benefit that using a material form to record and visualize means that calculations can be analyzed and revised, and they can become longer and more complex. So when it comes to relations and knowledge, there is no sharp discontinuity between movement and knowledge-based forms of calculating, or between material and mental calculation, as all these presuppose relations and knowledge. A more overt difference may be found in expressing large numbers, where notations may actually have an opposite effect, not just codifying, but canalizing and thereby limiting how numbers are formed. You'll see this with Yoruba numbers. Traditional Yoruba numbers are vigesimal or base 20. This system was also influenced by counting with cowrie shells, which were grouped as strings, bundles, and bags. Yoruba also uses a lot of subtractive forms. Subtraction is not unusual, as it is found in Roman numbers, where the words for 18 and 19 meant 2 from 20 and 1 from 20. Sumerian also had subtractive forms, as 18 in the table of reciprocals shown a few slides ago was 20 minus 2. But Yoruba has more subtractive forms than is typical. Instead of subtracting just 1 or 2 from 20, Yoruba subtracts 5 numbers, with 15 meaning 5 from 20. This suggests an influence of the material device used, cowrie bundles, as it would sometimes be easier to take some from a higher group than add more to a lower group. Yoruba counting has been described as a matter of taking up 5 cowries per hand, forming groups of 10. This suggests the dividing line for smaller amounts would be in the middle, making 14 from 10 a matter of adding and 15 from 20 a matter of subtracting. Other subtractive forms are seen around 200, where the impression of meeting in the middle is reinforced by the term for 100, which means half of 200. This emphasizes 2 things. First, numerical structure is influenced by the material forms used, and the material forms and their use in turn are driven by pragmatic choices, not whims. Second, numerical language preserves traces of these material forms and choices. In Yoruba, as the bundling amounts, the use of both additive and subtractive forms, and the balance between them. The really interesting thing about Yoruba is not its subtractive forms, but its non-canonical expression of higher numbers. That is, there isn't just a single right way to form a higher number like there is in the Western numerical tradition. We say 19,669, which adds the values multiplied by the powers of 10 in order from highest to lowest. If we were to start with the value 20,000 and then subtract, the result would not be well formed, nor particularly easy for us to understand. But in Yoruba, a large number can be expressed in a completely well-formed manner in multiple ways. There are at least 10 different ways to express this particular number. Consider how difficult it would be for us to express such a large and detailed number in 2 or 3 different ways, let alone 10, let alone with a mix of additive and subtractive forms, and let alone without writing. Relative to Western numbers, Yoruba seems to have a very different conceptualization of number, one that concatenates building blocks, which are the bundles of cowries. Higher values aren't the result of linear counting, but the multiplicative repetition of smaller values, which are then adjusted as needed by adding and subtracting. This made traditional Yoruba numbers combinatorial in a way that Western numbers aren't. It also implies an impressive mental ability to manipulate and keep track of the combinations, relations, operations, and remainders. The Western numerical tradition doesn't just lack an analogy, it seems absolutely impoverished in comparison. We don't have concepts or words for such forms, and we haven't been trained to think about or mentally manipulate numbers this way. Our limitations in this regard is likely related to the longevity of our number system, with frequent use tending to codify and limit how numbers are formed, a phenomena in which notations likely play a part. In comparison, cowrie counting appears to have lasted for only about 2 centuries from the late 1500s, so its emergence is recent, its temporal span short. From the literature, it's difficult to say what Yoruba mental arithmetic might have been like, though anthropologist Robert Armstrong thought Yoruba numbers were, quote, quite unsuitable for mathematics and useful only for, quote, counting in the forward direction. So expressing numbers may be one thing, adding and subtracting them mentally yet another, especially with the kind of numerical algorithms used in the Western tradition. It's likely the Yoruba people simply calculated materially with cowries, which would not be different in any essential respect from using an abacus or tokens or notations. But with Yoruba numbers, we get a radically different picture of what highly elaborated numbers can be like when they are not mediated by symbolic notations, one that offers a stark contrast to Schmatt-Besserat's severe and cognitively deficient picture of one-to-one correspondence without a number system. When Europeans sailed into the Pacific region a few centuries ago, Polynesian numbers were a highly elaborated system without symbolic notations. Polynesians counted into the tens of thousands and higher, and they had several forms of a functional abacus, one of which counted by sorting. While the details of the counting method need not detain us here, counting differed according to the physical characteristics of the item being counted. Items were picked up in singles or pairs or fours according to their weight and size. The process itself didn't vary. Counting still proceeded from 1 to 10, but the result was mentally doubled when the unit was pairs, quadrupled with fours, and the bundling used and the type of object being counted were encoded in language. That is, Polynesians counted different types of objects differently, and they conjointly represented quantity and commodity in language. Polynesian languages like Tongan encoded quantity and commodity by adding syllables or altering vowels to perform specifying or multiplying functions. This object-specified counting is likely what we see in Mesopotamia with the tokens and proto-cuneiform notations of the Uruk period, whose physical markings also specify or multiply. The difference is that Polynesians used language and a method of counting by sorting, while in Mesopotamia, tokens were used in addition to language and whatever method of physical counting was used. We might not see Polynesian type linguistic markers in Sumerian spoken numbers. However, our phonetic insight into Sumerian spoken numbers, specifically the larger ones more likely to be morphologically differentiated in object-specified counting, comes more than 1,000 years after the emergence of writing. This may be enough time for such markers to be lost, as they were in Polynesia over a similar span of time. When you put the different Polynesian counting systems together, including a unique binary variant that developed in Mangariva, the result looks a lot like what we see in Mesopotamia. In fact, if we were to replace the Polynesian words with different shapes and sizes to encode the numerical relations, the result looks just like the specified counting sequences of the Uruk period. The difference is that for Polynesia, we have detailed insight into the language for numbers and enough behavioral descriptions to reconstruct the counting method, evidence that is largely unavailable for ancient numbers. I should note that I do not see Polynesia as having any connection to Mesopotamia. In fact, Polynesia was a good case study for specified counting because of its lack of connection to the ancient Near East in any temporal, geographic, linguistic, cultural, social, or historical sense. This aspect of my research was recently accepted for publication and should appear in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies this fall. In summary, I talked about abstract and concrete in terms of what they mean in philosophy, psychology, and mathematics, how these labels have been applied and misapplied to Mesopotamian numbers, particularly in conjunction with the Neolithic tokens, and how we might better understand conceptual change without these labels. I said that conceptual change was not a matter of becoming abstract from a previous concreteness, but rather a prototypical process of numerical realization and elaboration that is achieved and systematized by the use of material devices, a process that the evidence shows as being true of Mesopotamia. I also mentioned 4 ways that writing changed numbers, noting that some of the changes were already well underway in conjunction with tokens, while others would continue for millennia. Finally, I suggested how we might better understand number systems that are highly elaborated, but not mediated by symbolic notations, using case studies from Africa and Oceania. This research highlights the importance of the ancient Near Eastern cultural heritage and the relevance of its continued study. As interpreted through the theories and methods of cognitive archaeology, Mesopotamia reveals how societies of average peoples were able to achieve complex systems like mathematics and literacy. The insights generated are not just applicable to the development of complex cultural systems in ancient times, but to the coevolution of cognition and culture in general, including our own present and future. Thank you all for your attention.
And thank you, Lee, for this wonderful and very instructive talk. I should say that this really opens new horizon on the origin of numerical notations and on the interaction with writings, since you have taken into consideration a wide range of different situations in which numerical notation might have originated or not from different materials. I would leave the floor to the audience. If anybody has questions, please raise your hand or write in the chat or directly unmute yourself and ask lively the question. Please, Stefan.
Thank you very much for a great talk. And as you know, I'm very sympathetic and have made a similar argument myself to this breaking apart of these notions of abstractness and concreteness. I have lots of things I could talk about. One, I guess, first though, is to push back just a little bit on the notion that we have very little variability in the number words of Western languages. So one of the great ways that we see this is, for instance, the number 1.2 million. Now I can say 1.2 million as 1.2 million. I can say 1,200,000. I can say 1,200,000. And even in 19th century English, the most common way to say this number was 1,200,000. So, I guess to some extent, the Yoruba case is obviously wild in its complexity. But I guess I'd like to push back a little bit on the notion that lexical numerals are there's just generally one system. I actually think there is less. Now, of course, what's different from the Polynesian case, or the Polynesian systems, is they're not object specific. They're not, but of course, neither are those Yoruba numerals. They may be linked to the cowrie count, but there's sort of those numbers that you listed are general purpose, as I understand it. And so I guess, here we are in the year 2021, or should I say 2021. And I actually think we can do better than I think that we need to push back on this notion that number systems are unitary phenomena and that cases like the Yoruba are exceptional. They're exceptional maybe at a quantitative difference, but not a qualitative one.
Well, I would respond in a couple of ways. One is what's interesting about that Yoruba example is it's a large and very detailed number, and that those have, from the authors that have offered those variants, that is said to be woven into the linguistic exchange of those numbers pretty typically. Where the examples you've cited, I don't disagree with that, but they tend to be simple numbers that can be expressed in several different ways. And and some of those are, especially the last one you mentioned, is a little hard to follow unless you were actually looking at it also visually. So yes, I agree that it's not a single system for English, but more typically there is a certain way that we're used to expressing things more often than not, where in Yoruba, they don't seem to have that. I would disagree with the claim that Yoruba numbers are exceptional though, because I see them as just informed by the material structures that they're using, these array of cowrie shells and the different bundles and groups. And it's perfectly consistent with the kinds of things that can happen based on using different material devices. It's just that that's not what most societies have done. And so it kind of looks very different in the different West African societies that are using cowries. But your point is well taken. It's not an absolute canalization on the Western number side. We are more flexible in language. Having said that, all of the different ways you mentioned sort of started out with 1.2 million. You didn't start with 2 million and subtract down, and theirs is much more combinatorial and dynamic than ours tends to be.
And then I think what we would really want to know, and I've read that Akinade and Odejobi study I think it's the one in the Journal of Language Modeling that you're talking about. And those guys are engineers, and obviously they're native speakers, so they know the system, but they're not linguists. And one of the things I'd really want to know is how common are any of these, right? That what we'd really want is a good corpus analysis to really have a sense of, are some of these marginal, are some of these recognizable or not, easily recognizable or not to Yoruba speakers, and are some of them really extremely rare in the way that that 1200,000 to me is now ungrammatical, but to a 19th century English speaker was perfectly grammatical. In fact, it was the most common way that the number was expressed. Now, of course, I'm not expecting you to have done that, but I would point out that this is actually a very important area of really understanding not just like what are the affordances of a system, but what are the practical realities of how a system is actually used, which really requires, of course, a much more detailed case-by-case analysis than would be possible in a big comparative study such as yours.
I have a couple of email dialogues going on. I'm trying to get responses from knowledgeable Yoruba speakers because I have the same questions. How many of these could the average person think up? How quickly could the average person think up these different variations? And so I agree. I would like to see a much more detailed study. And with regards to those authors being engineers, they're trying to build a model that will come up with these different combinations of words that are well formed in Yoruba, and that's you know their application of engineering. So it's I understood it more as computer modeling, trying to come up with a model that would be able to generate these kinds of different combinations. But I agree, there a lot more work needs to be done, and it's just unfortunate because a lot of the more recent studies on Yoruba have been in the context of how do we teach Yoruba people the base 10 system? How do we get them to do arithmetic and mathematics in the base 10 system? And you know, the base 10 system is just a completely, I mean, it's a different number system. And as soon as you start thinking in that one, you've really weakened, if not lost, the traditional number system. And that I think is a tremendous loss. It's just the West African cowrie counting systems are so interesting because they reveal something about our potential for thinking differently about numbers depending on the material structures that we're using.
Thank you, Lee. I see that Gary Urton has raised his hand. So please, hi Gary, good evening.
Thank you for a really interesting, wonderful presentation. I was interested in particular in the circumstance you were describing in which one might do calculations with some material object like an abacus, for instance, and then write out the results of that calculation in some other form. So in the system I work in the Quipus in South America, so we know that they were doing calculations in laptop size objects that were compartmentalized, and that you would move stones and beads or seeds around to do the calculations, and then you would record them by tying the knots. So my question is, what do you think is going on psychologically? Like, what is the difference between the manipulation of the material objects and the inscription, whether it's done in knots or writing or whatever? I mean, it seems like in terms of your question of the concrete and the abstract, that there's something really fundamental in that particular example that might give us some insights into what sort of mental processes are entailed in one versus the other.
Well, I'm fascinated by your work, and I'm a huge fan, I have to say. Very honored that you dialed in today.
Thank you.
Yes, it looks like, I mean, the yapana, or the moving corns around, as the various Spanish observers noted, European explorers have noted historically. Because, you know, a knot on a string cannot be tied or untied fast enough to calculate. It's just a mode of recording that is not manipulable enough, fast enough to make a feasible calculating device. But moving stones around can. Now, an abacus is an interesting thing because every time you move a stone, the quantity that you were just displaying is changed. So it only displays one number at a time, and it's got no memory. Every time you move, it's changed. So I would say that between the fact that they are probably only recording the final result in the knots, because it's you tie those knots and that they're kind of there, and they're just not a manipulable technology. And the fact that the manipulable technology has no memory, it just moves, that probably there is a huge mental component going on with not just moving the pieces, but remembering, all the different parts of the calculation that are going on. Maybe they're adding 3 or 4 things together and moving the pieces around and then tying the knots. So I would say it's a system that's geared for a large mental component. And this is what bothers me in particular about this idea that non-notational systems are concrete, is they seem to, the terminology seems to eliminate the possibility that people are actually thinking about numbers and relations between numbers and doing some mental manipulation in the process of manipulating these devices. I think we've underestimated them the worst in Mesopotamia because of that's where this terminology is concentrated. But I think with a lot of the other systems, like the West African cowries, with the Incan systems, the Mayan systems, there's a lot of these highly elaborated non-notationally mediated systems that I think have been underappreciated. And I think it's the kind of system that we currently understand the least. We've spent a lot of time looking at notationally mediated systems, and we've spent a lot of time looking at people like the Piraha and the Munduruku that, count to, 1 or 2 and maybe 5. And all the stuff in the middle, we've kind of said, well, we don't really, that's maybe not important, or it's all language, or, conceptual stuff in the brain that goes on. And it's a real gap in our understanding of numbers at this point.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I see that Thomas has raised his hand. Please, Thomas.
Thank you. A really wonderful talk. I've enjoyed it considerably. It's got me thinking about a lot of things. One of the areas that I'm looking at is how mathematics are used, and if it is a environment where you are negotiating or bartering for something in a fast-paced environment, or if you are using something that it takes more time. For instance, your example of marking how many livestock that you might have and setting it in the ground and then being able to take it up and making sure that you still have that count over a more extended period of time. Or the example of a clay envelope. I call it a thet because it in the Proto-Semitic is when you clap your hands together in a cup and you get your thumbs crossed, so you have a circle with a cup on it. And that portion allows you to put a number of objects that would symbolize potentially numbers of livestock or grain that you would take in a caravan over a long distance, maybe even traveling a month or 2 months, and to make sure that at the end of that journey you have a count that is going to pertain to whatever that you've tried to take over land or over sea to give to the recipient. And in particular, in a fast-paced environment, I think looking at letters like the Semek, where you have 3 crosses, and it has a sound of the S sound. And when you take your hands and rub your hands together multiple times, it when you get over to 3 or 4, it almost sounds like a snake, the hiss, 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 when you're rubbing your hands together. So I'm looking at how sounds of the letters can correspond to its use in mathematics. And so anyway, you've gotten me thinking about a lot of things, like the V is is generally associated with 20. And if you're broadcasting or throwing seeds, your hand is making kind of a V, and you're casting out seeds to plant on the ground. How those things can be used to show both division as well as addition in a fast-paced environment, and how how would you use this if you're talking with your hands in a environment where you're trying to negotiate the price of something or the amount of something that you're going to provide for a certain amount. So anyway, that's my area of study, and you've just brought up so many different questions here with all of this that I really have to think about it.
The use of the hands is particularly interesting to me. I've been looking at some of the 19th and 20th century literature on African finger counting systems written in German and Russian. Now, I got to admit, I don't speak any of these languages, but Google Translate is my friend, and I get the sense of it. And then I ask somebody that actually speaks those languages how close I am, and they tell me that, okay, fairly close, but here you go. So, you know, the hands are really important in representing, because they allow us to express an idea that we have that we don't yet have a word for it. Or if we're communicating with somebody that doesn't speak our language or doesn't know the number or the concept of the number, they understand the quantity. There's something translinguistic about the expression with the fingers. And this has no counterpart in conceptual domains like color, for example. It's another thing we perceive, but we can't create it we can't recreate it with our bodies. And what this does, we can use the hands to support the expression before we have language, or when we have language and we're communicating with somebody that either doesn't understand or doesn't speak the same language. And in the African finger counting systems, a lot of times they have names for the numbers that just mean and another, and another, and another. And so they're indicating their hands while they're saying, so they're using language, but not as naming the numbers, but they're naming the numbers in a way, but not with discrete names, because if I name you both and another, then you don't know which one I'm talking about linguistically. You have to look at my hands to understand that. And in terms of, you know, casting grain and seeing the shape of the hand, this is the idea that many of the signs that we use in notational systems, not just for numbers, but for non-numerical language as well, that we borrow cultural images. We anchor the meaning of things in cultural images that are understood and culturally shared, and so that kind of makes sense that if you're casting grain and you're seeing a V, that shape might turn up in something to do with casting grain.
Thank you, Toma and Lee, for this answer. I see Miguel has a question. Please, Miguel.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Lee, for this wonderful talk. As you know already, I agree, of course, that with the general idea that the concept of abstract versus concrete needed to be revised. My question was more of detail, and it was related to what you presented about Mangareva, because I don't know if you'd mind going back to that slide, but I couldn't get the idea behind that slide where you showed words for numerals with different colors, and you said something about those different parts. I think those different parts of those words having different meanings and working towards the system counting.
So I think you mean this one.
Yes.
Yes, it's just the ones in blue are meant to show that it's the same sound, and the ones in red are meant to show that it's a change and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to defend the idea of which of these are you know, what kind of morpheme. It's just that the sound, there's a subtle distinction in sound that differentiates that the net effect of this is to change the multiplied value, or to change or to specify the kind of object, or both.
Yeah, okay, because we with Sylvia, we dealt with Mangareva, but not in detail, and we didn't have a look at all of these subsystems, and some of them I'm not familiar with, but indeed, since Mangareva is an analytical language, like Polynesian languages, it should be something about morphemes rather than something that looks more like inflection. And in fact, I was looking at the yams and coconut system, and I was remembering that cow in Polynesian languages means something like a bunch, and I think there is an nga morpheme, usually prefixed, which means, well, indicates the plural as a grammatical particle. So I was thinking if those first three words sort of built on this to indicate the different meanings. So te being an article, te kao would be a bunch, and maybe wang gankao, ruang gankao, meaning two branches, and tolu gankao, tolu being three, so three branches, and so forth. Even the Rapa Nui language has the word kau atu, which means something like a group of 10. So yeah, but like I said before, I need to read your Polynesian paper. Thank you.
Yeah, this is actually Tongan and not Mangariban, and Tonga is in the western part of Polynesia, where the morphological differences of the counting systems are a bit different. They have a greater use of classifiers. Bender and Beller have a number of articles that have done a lot of work on this topic, and I would point you at that literature as sort of the authoritative resource on Polynesian use of numeral classifiers and object specified counting. Because I'm an archaeologist, I find this stuff interesting and congruent with how the material forms are used and structuring the words that come out. But in terms of which morphemes are what, I have to defer to the linguists.
Thank you, Lee. From one archaeologist to another, thank you. And I did read two papers by these authors, but not one that dealt specifically with the Tongan system, but I'll definitely have a look and at yours. Thank you so much.
Yeah, they've Sigurd Beller unfortunately passed away in 2018, but Andrea Bender is still writing, and between them they have at least a dozen articles on various aspects of Polynesia, which is a really, really interesting case study, because what you have coming in from the West is it's a decimal number system that then spreads to the eastern portion of Polynesia without encountering anything else. It's just uninhabited territory. And it's interesting to watch how the number system changes through this remote colonization process. You get from a standard base 10 system, you start seeing a characteristic upshift where the nominal value of terms is not 10 based, but 20 based, which led many historical sources to misidentify the Polynesian counting systems as vigesimal. And then on the very eastern fringe, the northern eastern fringe in Hawaii and Mangariba and the Marquesas, you have characteristic upshift by a factor of 4, so that everything, instead of 100, and in the middle you have 200, then on the northern and easternmost fringe, the same term means 400. So it's a really, really interesting study or a case study for how numbers elaborate under specific conditions, which is taking a set of numbers that you all have in common and then kind of spreading out, and the number systems change as you spread out, and then as people spread out further from there, it changes even more till you have these, in Mangariba, the most interesting one of all, this binary counting sequence. But it really looks like just a simple adaptation of the same counting process, coming up with these binary steps. And that's what you'll see in my JPS paper.
Very interesting. Is this also where we can find what you have just mentioned about this eastwards movement? Because I would be very interested in anything related to Central Eastern Polynesian languages, as I'm interested in the Rapa Nui.
Yeah, and I don't spend a lot of time on Easter Island, because the amount of numerical knowledge that has been preserved is very, very slim on Easter Island. I'm not convinced that the Rongo Rongo is a script. I agree with Piers Kelly and people that know early writing systems much better than I do, that it's at most a mnemonic device. It probably not a fluid script, and we can argue about terminology. But the things that have come down about Rapa Nui are the mistranslation or misunderstanding with the Spanish that came up with a completely different set of numbers when they tried to show them written numerals and got words that weren't numbers. And the possibility that, that people still talk about, and there's some genetic evidence that there actually was visitation from the continent of South America, but it doesn't look like it landed in Easter Island. It looks like it came past them and hit I think it's the Marquesas or the Gambier Islands. And so there's some genetic material in there from South America, but I still don't see Easter Island as having been influenced by South American number systems. It just, the little bit of information we have shows very standard Polynesian numerical counting, and some of the things that you might expect, like an unusual term, I think it's 1,000, that has no counterpart anywhere. That is just, it's like they forgot the actual term and they made one up on them, made one up themselves to fill in the sequence. And that's the kind of thing you would expect to happen if you're remotely colonizing and you forgot what that word was and you make up your own.
Yes, well, I definitely agree that based on well, first of all, on linguistic evidence we have and other pieces of evidence, most probably migration was from another part of Polynesian and with little or no influx from America. So okay. I would agree with that. I do disagree on the writing, on the script, because I think there is good indication that, well, there is this, I don't want to digress too much, but there is this one tablet which contains something showing many hints of being a lunar calendar, and there are glyphs that might be phonetic ways of writing names of the nights of the moon. But anyway, yes, indeed, another thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned this confusion with the Spaniards. There is actually an interesting article that argues that what the natives did was that they interpreted the Spanish number signs as shapes they were familiar with, possibly glyphs. And when you look at the words they said and you compare them with the shapes of the numbers, things like fish hooks and so forth, it sort of makes sense. I can send that article to you if you'd be interested in.
Yeah, sure. I'm familiar with the argument, so it's likely I already have it, but just to be sure, please send it to me so that because I always want to make sure that I have read everything possible.
Sure.
But yes, the thing that's the most interesting to me about the thing that happened with the Spanish in the 1600s is those written numerals are so unquestionably numerical to the Spanish. It doesn't even occur to them that the Easter Islanders would not have understood them. And if they had showed them something, what I would call a precursor technology, if they had showed them an abacus, chances are the Easter Islanders would have understood it as a counting device. And it's just that there's so much implicit knowledge required to understand the numerals. You have to know the meaning that the shape encodes, and not just things like, things like positional weighting and so on. You have to know, there's so much implicit knowledge encoded in that wouldn't have been accessible to the Polynesians because their indigenous counting practices didn't have those things. And exactly. For me, that is specifically the incident that got me thinking about the implicit knowledge and how it allows the explicitly represented component to shrink so that we can bring large volumes of numerical representations under simultaneous viewing conditions. Because previous technologies before notations just really don't feasibly allow you to do that. I started out with studying the tokens, and for a couple of years I've toyed with the idea of what it would take to make a table of multiplication out of the tokens. You take your whole floor, you wouldn't be able to see it all that easily. God help the person that tries to walk across the room, because, you know, it's worse than any banana peel if you slip and fall on it and you can't move it anywhere. It's not a material form that's geared for large volumes of simultaneous representation. But when you get to the notations, you've got that concision, and all sorts of things start being potentialized and opportunized from there.
Yes, it definitely makes sense. And I wonder if for someone from Rapa Nui, it wouldn't be easier to write the word, for example, to write the word tahi, which means one. It might be as easy just to, you know, draw a scraper, a tool, a scraper, because to scrape something is tahi tahi, and the root involved is tahi, which means basically the same thing. So yes, you might have done, in the case of Rapa Nui, what you call ideographic, but at the same time with a factor of what you call pictographic or iconicity, if you will. And indeed, I tend to agree that the Spaniards might not have thought that the native just had something different technologically and would not recognize them. Even a tally would work better.
From the literature, it's not completely clear whether those notations pre-existed before the Spanish came. So it's possible that the Spanish visit transferred the idea of writing to the Easter Islanders, so it's not completely clear that that is an indigenous, an authentic, or a completely independent indigenous invention. And you know, no problem if it's not. It's just it just makes it more recent and a cultural diffusion. Rather than something that came up from the grassroots.
Again, I wouldn't like to digress too much.
Yes, I see we got a couple more questions.
Yeah, indeed. Let's continue in private.
Thank you, Miguel. And I see that Stefan has something to add.
Yeah. So this has all got me thinking, and I've been thinking about this for a while, about quinary and base 5, because of course there are some weirdnesses. First of all, that quinary is actually less common than you might imagine it would be, right? That it's there in Sumerian and Nahuatl, but you know, there are so many of these areas where there might be quinary notation, but where there's no quinary lexical numeration. Chinese doesn't have it, Egyptian doesn't have it, Semitic doesn't have it, Proto-Indo-European doesn't, you know, Welsh is the only really quinary, Old Welsh, not modern Welsh. And so in a sense, the number word systems, it's not that it's absent. Of course, you're right, it's there in Sumerian and Nahuatl, and there are other examples could be adduced, but part of, I guess, given how common decimal number words are, it seems to me striking how rare, relatively, quinary lexical numeration is. That given the examples that you're talking about, that you would expect if it was, you talked about the sort of, well, it's the first one past the subitizing limit, and of course it is. But if that were the case, if that were really the motivation, wouldn't we expect it to be much more common than it is? Wouldn't we expect, in the sense that, you know, 70 to 80% of the world's number systems are decimal, wouldn't we expect lots and lots of those systems to have a quinary subbase? In particular, because we have cases like Roman numerals have a subbase of 5, Latin lexical numerals, no subbase of 5. The Chinese abacus has a quinary subbase. Chinese lexical numerals don't. And I could go, you know, and so it almost seems like quinary notation is really more of a property of notational and embodied and materialized cognition. But when you get to the lexical framework, it's actually rarer than you would think. And I'm wondering what your response is to that.
I don't disagree with the fact that the Roman and Chinese examples are very interesting in having a material form with a subbase and a lexical form with no subbase. I do think that's extremely interesting. I'm not sure that I share the same impression with you, because when I look across the North American data or the Papua New Guinean data, I see a lot of quinary systems in there. In fact, in some of the North American systems, they count up to 30 in groups of 5, and after that seem to do something else. So I guess where my thinking is that it's a decision that you make on how to use the material device. Do you use both hands? If so, do you divide them up, or do you continue counting? I get the impression from the linguistic data that you're more likely to divide things up into groups of 5 if you also use the toes, because there's a lot of formations that say, you know, it's my first hand and two on my second hand, and it's my first foot and 2 on my second foot. So you're specifying which fingers, which toes on which hands and which feet. And that seems to make both a physical and a linguistic difference in natural groups of 5, none of which really explains counting to 30 in 6 groups of 5. So I just see them as different decisions that different human groups have made regarding how that material device is used. Do you continue to the second hand? And if so, when do you switch? Do you involve the feet? Do you involve the limbs of the next person over? Or do you ask that person to keep track of the tens while you're counting the units? It's all different ways of potentially using the very same material form, and part of this fascinating variability of how a material form can be used.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things is that, you know, once some system gets started, you know, it may in fact become relatively divorced from the everyday counting practices. We have no assumption that, you know, Sumerians, just because there was the sub base of 5 and that they weren't necessarily all using that sort of embodied practice on a regular basis. But you know, given I think, you know, what's really needed, of course, is really a broader study. World Atlas of Language Structures doesn't talk about quinary at all. Just talks about decimal and vigesimal. They don't really divide up and ask how common is the quinary structure. And I think there's a lot of conflation of numerical notation and lexical numeral, in the sense that most Mayan languages aren't quinary, for instance. Even though Maya, of course, have the bars and dots, and we sort of think about Maya as, oh, that's classically quinary. If you look at Jeffrey Colville's 900+ page dissertation on Mesoamerican number systems, it's pretty rare, actually. The Mesoamerican numbers, Highland, and Central Mexican numerals have lots of them. And I have that, Lee, by the way. I can send it to you if you like. It's a little hard. No. I have a PDF. If shoot me an email to remind me. But quinary is kind of more haphazard than I would think. And so I think it's an interesting question, but I don't think we have good answers to it, because I don't think the linguists have been as interested as they should be in that particular element, with some exceptions. There are people who are interested.
Well, one of the things that happens, I've been working with 2 colleagues on a paper about the Dasana, because that's a number system that has some very interesting subsequent developments, which I'll leave for the paper. I won't mention them here, but the basic system is a quinary system. It counts to 20, and 20 is as many as the digits on a man, but they don't count above 20, so it's not a vigesimal system, as formally defined by the 2 linguists that have studied the system. They do divide 20 into 4 groups of 5, and the names for these numbers are all extremely lengthy phrases describing the fingers of the hands and the toes, and which hand and which foot that you've got. If you were to try and recite those in sequence, which they have not been described as doing, you would have a lot of words to say, and that would be a fairly cumbersome system. So there's some pressure on the number words to become shorter, and this is why the hands are so essential, is because you can do it visually and support the truncation of those words, and everyone still knows what you mean because you can still count them right there on your hands. This might exert a pressure for 2 things. One is that the words become shorter as a function of use, as supported by the hands, And the other thing is, it might tend to influence things towards a base 10 simply because you've got both hands there as the most immediate instrument of counting. And that might flatten the division by fives, like it might flatten or weed out the involvement of the feet.
Okay, I see that Gary has a further question or comment. Please, Gary.
Yes, one comment and one question. So the comment is that in terms of quinary systems, I've argued that I think in the Inca system, which was a base 10 system, I think that it evolved from an earlier Aymara system, which was a quinary system. And we can see some evidence for that in what was the pre-Inca kind of quipu, which was related to the Wari state. But to go into that gets us too far down that very obscure road right now. But the main question that I had for Lee was that in an earlier commentary, so there was mention of the calendar. And this is kind of a quixotic suggestion or consideration, but I wonder why it is there's no base 365. And in particular, I wonder if the universally observable fact, which may be one of the few universally observable facts of the rough count of 30 as the synodic lunar period, if there might in fact be some reason to sort of consider or wonder whether or not there's some element of a recognition of that underlying some of these systems. Well, again, just pure speculation, but.
One of my very early studies, and quite honestly, one I did as an undergraduate, published in 2013 in Cambridge Archaeological Journal. The title is Material Scaffolds in Numbers and Time. I was looking at the links between numerical elaboration and socio-material culture, and you know, my interest was in saying, how high do you count? What devices are you using? What kinds of things are you using numbers for? And in that final category of what kinds of things you're using numbers for, are you counting time and things like age and so on? And you know, it's a fairly, you do a lot of research, you come up with an answer that everyone says, well, of course it works that way. Why'd you bother to do a study? We all knew this to begin with. But you know, if you are using material devices to count, you do tend to count higher and more often. And you do tend to count things that devices can help make visible, like time. And you do start counting things that you probably wouldn't use a device for, like age. Instead of just saying this guy's older and the next guy's younger, you say this guy's 8 years and that guy's 4 years. And so numbers become enmeshed, they become a way of thinking, and you start implying them. You start applying them to more and more different domains. And in that quantification of time, what I see in terms of the devices is you have devices that keep track of lunation primarily. And lunation is just a lot easier to get a hold of than the 365 day year, the solar year. And, you know, there's a lot of interest in the solar year simply because, and the best example I have, I think it's a Inuit language. You know, the names of the months in the very dark winter that's headed towards spring are words that mean we've run out of food. We're eating things that basically aren't edible and weren't supposed to be eaten. And by the way, we've run out of those and we're really, really hungry. And they're just waiting for spring, you know, for the signs of growth. So there's this intense interest in figuring out, is the sun coming back and how long do we have to wait? And do we have enough food? And how are we gonna survive in the meantime? So lunation is really pretty easy. The solar year is essential. And as you start quantifying these things, societies come up with the idea that there's a mismatch between those two. And at first, they're not sure what to do about the mismatch. You know, time goes on and they get more complex about, you know, observations and record keeping. And then they come up usually with some kind of adjustment. The Mayans had one, the Romans had one that we still basically use today. And you know, this period that adjusts the difference between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar so that you basically keep track. Now the Sumerians had something different still. They had basically a system of 30-day months, and it would make sense to me that there's a interstitial period that helps reconcile the administrative year with the actual physical year. But I haven't seen any literature that you know talks about that. I'm sure people have investigated. I just don't know. But what it speaks to me about in looking at the administrative calendar is this is a system of timekeeping that's very, very old. And it just points back to numbers coming from the Paleolithic. It just reinforces my impression that they're very, very old. A little off the track of the question that you asked, but I think that numbers and the devices that we're using for numbers help us get at these more intangible domains that we can quantify, like time, in a way that it just takes time to develop complexity in the system. That doesn't, if you still have a question about quinary, please ask me, because I've gone on enough that I've lost track.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee. I'm very happy to see how lively this Q&A session is. Your talk really spiked the curiosity of the audience. I see one further question or comment, Babette.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk and the information you gave us. It gave me a lot of food for thought because I'm a retired elementary school math educator turned volunteer Smithsonian researcher on Near East archaeology. And so as I was listening to what you had to say, it made me really start thinking about both the patterns of the mathematics and the language and the use of the concrete versus the abstract that kind of pervade through the different cultures, and then looking in a different direction, looking at it as an educator and thinking, okay, what are the implications of these patterns on how we're teaching mathematics today? Because I think that idea of abstract concrete interwoven with the patterns found in the development in the cultures maybe speaks to some of the difficulties we're having teaching today. And I'm constantly struggling in what I'm doing now and thinking, how can I take this knowledge that we've gained and the patterns that we're seeing archaeologically and transfer them into an educational setting to make use of them? So I'd be interested to hear what you may have learned, you know, from your research and experiences.
I think the analytic framework that I have developed to show numbers as concepts of discrete quantities arranged in magnitude order with relations between them and operations that manipulate those relations, and looking at the devices and how they add those different properties into a system of numbers. I think maybe that decomposition does provide a potential for maybe presenting the material in a different manner to children with difficulties understanding some of the concepts. Having said that, I know very little about children with dyscalculia or you know, the different types of difficulties or incapabilities in learning numbers and maths. And so I would need to work to learn much more about that before I could say how my framework might help. I'm certainly available to discuss that further because I really think there's some potential there. It just takes some partnership with people that know what the difficulties are before we can say, you know, whether the framework really answers some of those difficulties.
Thank you.
So feel free to shoot me an email if you want to explore that further, because I would be
Okay.
delighted to explore that further.
Thank you.
And we have been delighted to have you here, Lee, for this talk, for this SCRIBO seminar. If there is any other question or comment, no other question, I would like to thank you warmly again, and
My sincere pleasure.
and say goodbye to everybody, and thank you to the audience too, and see you for our next SCRIBO seminar, which will be announced through our social media and webpage. So thank you again, and bye-bye. Have a lovely evening. Night.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.